Listen.
All right.
Anything you want to say?
Ready?
Let me just hold it up on this part.
This, of course, just used to be a rather rough hillside with the top of the ridge in here. By the time we made excavations for the basement of the building, we had a big pile of raw dirt, and this was a very rough design, and we decided that we would like to have an amphitheater. None of us had ever built one or really seen one, but we did indicate the contours of it and the requirement that it must drain out there so that it wouldn't catch water in the middle of the basin. Otherwise, we turned loose a man with a cat and a bucket, and he went round and round and round on the thing until he had made it. And it was a great tribute to his skill. It's a beautiful job. We can seat 1,000 people in this bowl, and the acoustics are just wonderful. The ordinary speaking voice down on the center carries in the whole bowl. But we love the view of height above the lake and the total vista. And always of children playing. If the children were up here, the first thing they would do is to get down and roll down the hill. You would try it. This whole wooded hillside is really a burial ground. The mission house is just through the woods a little bit further, and so this whole area became a common burial ground from the mission. Very few of the stones are marked so far as we know, though I'll show you some of the marks later. But this graves, Simon Fraser and his wife moved here in the 1870s. And raised a large family, and their families and the succeeding generations have populated all the surrounding communities. It's a very large, extensive family. And they have kept up these two graves. It was really at that time just sort of in the backyard of Granny and Grandpa Fraser. But it's been a treasure just to have it. it's a matter of a great amazement to me that these springs should be here at all. We're really up on quite a high ridge here, 250 feet above farmland, to the north at least, but about 10 springs per mile are around the basin of this lake. And they tell us now that they believe the source of this water is far back towards the mountains, and that it comes, there's a great head of water far back there with enough elevation to force this water underground through the shales and coal and so on, and then when it hits an obstruction, it's forced up to the surface. That seems to be what causes them. But at any rate, there's a great succession of springs and seepways all around the lake. But this is a very strong one and a very constant one. It's just always just like this. And so it was naturally a very attractive location for a winter camp, for hunting with your forest behind you, the lake in front, and the source of fresh water. And it became the choice of location then when the Reverend Robert Rundle and his associate Benjamin Sinkler and native leaders with them were looking for a place to found a settlement to introduce agriculture. That was why they decided they should take this one. And so they located this in the fall of 1847. And Ben Sinkler moved into it in the fall and stayed here all winter. Rundle went back to England the next year and couldn't return. But the native Christian leadership then stayed on in this place and maintained it for the next many years. There were a few missionaries appointed later on, but essentially this was a place led by native leadership from its origin. And they had quite a lot built in here. They would say, for example, it was like a small village in the middle of the wilderness. We have found at least 12 building sites scattered around through the area here with only without having disturbed the soil at all. The main research is all still ahead of us here in the discovery of what has been here. But this famous, beautiful old spring was the heart and soul of it. The mission was founded here in 1847, but it was rather slow in developing. The native peoples weren't living here on a constant basis. They were moved about and had different campsites for different seasons. But gradually, it began to establish a life of its own. John McDougall came then in 1865 and began to form a community around the mission. And with that, then, the desire to build a mission house. So he was started at that. The mission house was finally finished in 1872. And his father, the Reverend George McDougall, was in Edmonton just finishing what is now known as the McDougall Church, Edmonton. But this one was done first, this one done in 72. And on the weekend then of the opening of this, the father, the Reverend George, came out to spend the weekend with his son, and they had here a gathering of 300 native Christians who had come from as far south as what we now call the Eden Valley Reserve down near High River. From High River, Bow River, Kootenai Plains, Buck Lake, the Stonies from all of the eastern slopes had gathered here. And they for the opening of the church in May of 1872. So that was a particularly important weekend. Partly it was a sort of a celebration of the growth of the native Christian church, in which native people provided their own leadership, used their own language, and did it in their own way and for their own purposes. But it was also just the end of that experience, because by now, in 1872, there was a government of Canada, and we now had Indian agents, and the surveys were taking place, and the Indian communities were now being sort of reassigned places to live. Reserves were being formed. And so all day Sunday was a joyous celebration of singing and of praying and of marrying and baptizing, and a great celebration of a church here. And on Monday morning, they met in council out on this same hill and began to face up the change that was coming. And they knew that they had to draw up a line that would be a demarcation line between Stony Country and Cree Country to direct the commissioners who were coming out to survey the reserves. And they knew that they were being overwhelmed by a foreign race and a foreign language, and that their natural resources were disappearing, and they just didn't know what to do. And Chief Bearspaw made a most dramatic and impassioned plea of his people in the face of this thing that was happening to them. I think it's one of the most dramatic documents that we have of the transition from a straight native culture community into a culture that came to be dominated by an invading culture. Well, that just happened here, and it's really rather wonderful that we can have the place and have the document to rehearse what happened that day. But the building stayed here then. The mission was open until 1883. In '86, then a surveyor by the name of J.B. Tyrrell, the Tyrrell Museum at Drumheller was later named after him, but Dr. Tyrrell came through on a surveying trip, and he made a special trip to Pigeon Lake to see the old mission. And so he came up here and took the picture of the old log building, and it's his picture that we now are able to show. And we have also his notes for the visit to Pigeon Lake and what he found here. And so eventually we can come on the track of all of these people and stand in the same place. The first to speak was the head chief, Bearspaw. He brought to my mind some famous words that no barbarous people can rise to civilization without help. Bearspaw said, "We are like men filled with sorrow today and crushed with a dread of tomorrow. We see the natural resources of our country rapidly disappearing. Strange tongues tingle in our ears, warning us that a race stronger than we are approaching. We cannot believe ourselves that the good and great Spirit will suffer his poor children to perish, but we have no resources within ourselves. Our past habits are all against us. No implements with which to begin, no center around which to rally. We often sit by the graves of our fathers and talk of the past and tremble at the future. Friends of the lost, put us on the right track. Tell our praying fathers when you meet them at Red River that we send the salutation of our nation to them."